Afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Introducing Switches to Develop Early Communication Skills. My name is Erica Smith, and I am the Assistive Technology Lead for Highfurlong Special School in Blackpool. And today's webinar is going to be delivered by my colleague, Sarah Alderman, who is a specialist speech and language therapist. If there's any questions, we'll take them at the end. If you could just pop them in the chat box, and then I'll present them to Sarah when she's finished presenting. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Erica. Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Alderman. Thank you all for coming today. I am a specialist speech and language therapist, and our topic today is introducing switches to develop early communication skills. I thought I'd give you a little bit of background information about me just before we get started, just so that you can see why this is an area of interest to me. So I've worked in special education settings for around the last 12 years. And I have a specific interest in supporting students who have limited verbal communication skills. So that's generally using alternative forms of communication. So it might be a communication book, it might be electronic equipment such as an iPad with a communication app, or it might be a designated communication aid like an eye gaze device. When I started working with this kind of group, I realized that I was going to have to upskill myself in alternative forms of access. So most of the children who I work with have physical disabilities, and they can't access computer screens typically through pointing or using a keyboard and a mouse. So alternative access was an area that I needed to explore. So I went to the ICE Centre in Manchester about 8 or 9 years ago, and I studied access and control there. And that was where I really first developed my interest in switches as a means of access to communication aids. And that's formed some of the basis of today's webinar, as has my ongoing experience and research, as it's a constantly developing field. So this is not a really comprehensive view of switches. It's a whistle-stop tour, and it's a bit of an overview. And if there's something that you need to know more about, I've got some resources and some links at the end. So hopefully we can signpost you to learning even more about using switches for communication. So let's get started. So before we dive into the webinar, I just wanted to explain a little bit about us. So we're part of the EdTech Scheme, and we've been bringing you a series of webinars over the last few months, and we're going to continue to do that throughout the next school year. So we are 3 schools: Highfurlong School, which I belong to, Ribblesdale High and Hambleton. And the 3 of us together have been supporting schools with elements of technology for teaching and learning. And Highfurlong, we've been focusing on supporting schools with assistive technology and communication aids. And if that's something you're really interested in, there is a link on our final slide, and you can sign up, and we can hopefully provide you with more support for free. So please have a little look at that if you're interested. We'll have a look at what we're going to cover in the webinar today. So hopefully by the end of this webinar, you will have learned about the assessment process for introducing switches, and we'll consider some of the issues around that. We'll look at early switch activities and how you might introduce using a switch. We'll then look at how to develop switch skills, so some of the skills that build on those early switch activities. We'll then look at using switches with communication software, which for me is the ultimate goal. So the activities that we do leading up to that are aiming to access a communication aid. Towards the end of our webinar today, Eric is going to pop back on and talk a little bit about using switches to access the computer, which is so vital and important for our kids within the classroom environment as well. So hopefully we will cover everything as best as we can. We'll start with the basics. Why would you use a switch? So I know I briefly covered this in my introduction, but when a child can't access a communication aid through direct access, which is using their fingers, they need some alternative form of access. So that might be using a switch. There are other options as well, so things like a head mouse, eye gaze. Every child is a complete individual and their access means will be different, which is why the assessment process is so important and considering what's easiest and most accessible for that child. But switch access can be a really successful alternative form of access for some children, and it can be a really fast means of accessing a communication aid. So we'll explore that throughout this webinar. There are lots of different types of switches, and they can be accessed by different parts of the body. Basically, any part of the body that you can move intentionally and you can repeat that movement, you can access a switch. So you can see in the pictures on this slide, our top picture here, this is a young girl from Highfurlong. She's accessing a switch with her head to use an iPad. In the bottom picture, we've got a young girl using a communication aid, and she's accessing the switch with her hands. So there are lots of different ways that you might use a switch. There are also a range of different methods for using switches. Some children might use one switch, some might use two. There are scanning patterns and all kinds of really complex techie things that we'll look at in a little bit more detail. Again, each individual's use will differ, and that's very much part of that ongoing assessment process. So the assessment is very rarely a one-off. We tend to assess as we go along and tweak things to meet the child's needs. I thought before we look at assessment, because I'm going to be talking about different types of switches, I would show you some switches. So this is not an exhaustive list of switches, as there are probably hundreds. I could probably do an entire webinar on types of switches. If you look on the Inclusive Technology website, you will see lots and lots of different types of switches. But the ones that I have on this slide are the ones that we use most frequently in Highfurlong School, and the ones that I tend to return to most frequently. So the first is our jelly bean switch, which is probably the most commonly used type of switch. And if you work in a special school setting, you're probably already familiar with the jelly bean switch. So they're generally a round switch. You can have large and small jelly bean switches, generally accessed with a press and release kind of motion. You might access it with your hand, you might access it with your head, or perhaps a knee or an elbow. The jelly beamer switch, which is next to the jelly bean switch, is a wireless switch. Now this is quite useful because, as you can imagine, when you're using lots of different types of technology, there can be a lot of wires, which sometimes can get tangled, sometimes people can trip over. So the wireless switch can be quite useful. It's also really useful for classroom use. So let's say a group of students are all working together on a switch activity on the computer. Being able to pass the jelly beamer switch around the classroom is much easier than passing a wired switch around the classroom. So the bottom four switches are more specific switches for children who maybe struggle with that access, that lift and release motion. The wobble switch is one that I really like and use again and again. It's really good for children who don't perhaps have that up and down motion, but they maybe can have a sideways motion. It's quite sensitive as well. So I work with a young boy who, when he's in a side lying position, will use a wobble switch, and he can access it with his little finger, just with that kind of motion. So it's really quite a useful switch. I've also used it with head, chin, lots of different parts of the body. The proximity switch is a really nice idea. Some children can initiate that movement towards the switch, so they know they want to access the switch, but they perhaps can't quite make contact with it. So the proximity switch is aware that the child has made movement towards it and will then activate. The PAL-pad switches, these are switches that we use quite frequently at Highfurlong. You can see they come in different sizes and they're a flat switch. I would use a PAL-pad switch when I'm working with a child who gets a lot of sensory feedback from the jelly bean switch. So the jelly bean switch makes a clicking sound, and it also moves up and down as you press it. I've worked with some children who enjoy that click and the movement more than the activity because they're getting the sensory feedback from that. So in that case, a PAL-pad switch is ideal as it doesn't have that sensory feedback. The child is more likely to be focused on the activity. They also are quite low impact. You don't really need to press them particularly hard to activate a PAL-pad switch. The last one on the slide is a pillow switch. This is a nice soft switch with a covering over it. In the previous slide, I'll just show you. The young girl at the top is using a pillow switch with a nice dinosaur cover that one of our teachers very kindly sewed, as this little girl is mad about dinosaurs. So the pillow switch is ideal for when you're using a part of the body that is, you maybe don't want to be making hard contact with a switch like a jelly bean switch, which is quite hard. So if you're repeatedly moving towards the switch, soft contact is ideal. For example, in the case of the young girl in the previous slide, she wears glasses. So when she was making contact with a hard switch, it was actually knocking her glasses off. So using the pillow switch was an ideal alternative for her. We'll move on to the assessment process. Assessment really should involve a multidisciplinary team. That's kind of the gold standard for assessment. But I know that that's tricky, as not everybody has this specialism around switches. But if you can get advice from an occupational therapist, a physio, or your local AAC service, or an assistive technologist, then that's ideal, really, to come together and to work on this as a team. So assessment should really consider, firstly, the child's motivation. So when I'm introducing a switch to a child, I need to think about what motivates them, because if they're not motivated, they're not going to be interested in joining in with the activities. And we really need to gauge how they access the switch. So high motivation is important, as is enjoyment. If a child enjoys the activity, they're more likely to participate in it, which is key when we're having a look at switch access. Cognition. So what I mean by cognition here is that idea of understanding that when you press the switch, it's causing something to happen, which is a skill called cause and effect. And it's really the foundation for using a switch. So the child needs to be aware that pressing the switch is making something happen. Then there are lots of other skills to build on from cause and effect. So it's important to consider all of those elements within your assessment as well. Then obviously the position of the individual is very important, as is the position of the switch. A tool that we use at Highfurlong and that I think you might find quite useful is the ACE Centre Switch Assessment and Planning Framework. So I've included a link here, and if you click on the link, it takes you to a page where you can download a PDF of the Switch Assessment Framework. And that talks you through the different levels and the different skills that are required for using a switch, for using a communication aid. And it also looks at access. So as I've said before, it's really important to think about the multidisciplinary team involved in assessment. However, it's not always possible to liaise with an OT or a physio when you need to. What I tend to do is I'll read physio and OT notes or any recent reports before I'll have a look at an assessment. And then I'll liaise with the physio or the OT afterwards if I haven't been able to assess alongside them. And I'll discuss the area that I think is the best access point for the child and make sure that there aren't any physical contraindications, as obviously we don't want to mount a switch to an area that might cause some physical issues for the child, which is why we need to liaise with the experts, which are our OTs and physios. So just a few more important points to consider around assessment. The picture here is taken from the ACE Centre assessment framework, and it shows you basically all the different parts of the body that might access the switch, considering whether the right side or the left side of the body might be easier for the child. And these are some points that I always consider. The first is the most important, really. The movement has to be the easiest and most reliable movement for the child. So for example, a few years ago, I worked with a child and they, when I assessed them, could use their right hand quite easily, and they had a really good press and release motion, and they could do that repeatedly. When I fed that back to class staff, a really well-intentioned member of staff said to me, That's great, but why don't we tie in with physio goals? So the physio has suggested that we need to use the left hand a little bit more. So I can see completely where they're coming from, but obviously if the left hand is a less dominant hand and the child is struggling with that, then it's not going to be the easiest, most reliable movement for them, and they might become frustrated. When we're looking at communication, we want it to be easy and we want it to be motivational. Our final goal is communication. It's not the movement itself. So it's really ensuring that that movement is easy and reliable. We have to consider the child's posture for accessing the switch, and does this change during the day? So for example, most children will have more than one wheelchair, and most of our kids will have a home chair, a school chair. They might be in different positions throughout the day, such as a standing frame, maybe a side lier. Ideally, we would assess them in each of these positions to check for switch access, as it's going to change depending on which position they're in. If the child really struggles to access the switch in a specific position, so let's say in the standing frame, we need to think about alternatives. So I would always suggest, even if a child, the switch is their predominant use of accessing a communication aid, that we'd maybe have a paper-based backup, so a communication book alongside their electronic communication aid, and then they might use that within certain positions throughout the day. We need to look at intentional, repeatable movements available to the child. Some children have involuntary movements, so we need to ensure that they aren't accidentally activating the switch, as that could be very frustrating for the child. The type of switch, so I've shown you a few different types of switches at the beginning of our webinar today, and you can see there are many different types. So we need to consider the size. Can the child activate quite a small switch? Do they need a larger size? The sensory feedback. So I talked about the jelly bean switch and how that clicking sound is maybe quite motivational to some children, more so than the activity. So do we look at a flat PAL pad switch instead? The sensitivity of the switch. Some children who I work with will bash the switch quite firmly, and we might need to consider a pillow switch in that case. Other children might need a really sensitive switch because they might only lightly access the switch. Finally, the positioning of the switch, thinking about mounting the switch to the easiest point of access so that it's consistently in the same place. Something that we do at Highfurlong that's quite useful is we take a photograph of the child and the switch when it's mounted in the optimum position, and we keep that photograph somewhere that all members of staff can access it. That means that they can refer to it every time they remount the switch so that it's consistent. So just to illustrate some of the points around assessment, I thought I would show you a little bit of a case study. So this is a young girl from Highfurlong, and you can see she has a jelly bean switch mounted towards her left hand, and it's plugged into an iPad, which is in a speech case. I'll talk to you a little bit about speech cases later in the webinar. And she's using an app called Snap and Core First. So the assessment process with this young girl has been ongoing. It's never really, I would say that it's very rare that I would do a one-off assessment for access. It tends to be an ongoing process. So sometimes it's a little bit trial and error. We might try one switch and then realize actually throughout the day as a child becomes tired, that isn't the easiest means of access for them. In other cases, it might be that as a child's skills progress, we need to go back and reassess. So these are some of the things that we've considered in the assessment process for this young girl. First of all, I had to ensure her understanding that pressing the switch causes something to happen. So that idea of cause and effect. And we did this through using switch toys. So things like singing teddy bears. She would press the switch and it would make the teddy bear sing. And we could very quickly gauge that she understood that she was controlling that using her switch. We had to take into account her motivators. So she loves music and TV. You can see on her screen here, she has The Greatest Showman, Minnie Mouse, Peppa Pig, so all things that are quite motivational to her. From a language perspective, looking at her understanding, she could understand core words like more, stop, like, and not. That's important because when we're looking at using a communication aid, we could begin with maybe scanning between two words like more and stop in, for example, a music activity, and she would press the switch when she heard or the word was highlighted that she wanted. If you want to learn a little bit more about core words, we did a webinar a few months ago on an introduction to AAC, and that's available on our website. From a physical perspective, this young girl has better movement of her left arm than her right, and the switch is mounted to that position so that it's always consistent. So you can see it's mounted here. This young girl also has a visual impairment, so she actually quite benefits from the sensory feedback of the jelly bean switch. When she hears the click, she knows she's activated the switch, whereas a PALPad switch might be difficult for someone like this young girl, as she wouldn't be aware that she's actually made contact with the switch. As she has visual impairment, her app is set to an auditory scan. We'll talk a little bit more about auditory scan later, but generally most children, when they are using a switch with a scan, it's a visual scan. So each item is highlighted, perhaps with a border, and the child will press when they see the item is highlighted that they want. This young girl listens for auditory cues, and when she hears the auditory cue that she wants, she then presses the switch. So that's where we're up to with this young girl, but as I said, assessment is ongoing depending on how her skills progress. So let's have a little look at the next slide. Early switch activities. I've talked quite a bit about cause and effect already. So that idea that when you press the switch, it causes something to happen. You can see in the photograph here, we have a young girl from Highfurlong and she's playing with a switch toy. So this toy looks like a monkey, I think. He sings and dances when she presses the switch, and you can see how engaged she is and that she's understanding that she is in control of this toy. So there are lots of different activities that you can use to build cause and effect skills even before you start looking at using a switch for communication. So switch toys, switch adapted equipment. Most things that have a plug, you can really adapt to use with a switch if you have something called a power link box. So for example, lights in the sensory room can be switch activated. You might have a fan that's switch activated. Kitchen equipment like a whisk, you can switch adapt. So the child is pressing the switch and then they can use the whisk independently. I have put a little list of switch adapted toys and equipment at the end of the webinar today from the Barnsley Assistive Technology team. And if you're interested in purchasing these kind of toys and equipment, have a little look at that and you'll find some good suggestions. Cause and effect games. So there are lots of these on various websites, but the one that we use most frequently at Highfurlong is called Help Kids Learn. So basically the child might start with a black screen. They would press the switch and then a colourful, bright, moving image would appear on the screen. That image would then fade and the child would have to press the switch again to reactivate it. It's worth considering the complexity of the task and the skills involved when you're looking at these early switch skills and developing cause and effect, as sometimes the task can be more difficult than it might appear to be. So you can see this little diagram at the bottom. It says make something happen. So for some switches, you might have to press and hold for the toy or equipment to be activated. Some activities and toys, it might be a press and let go. Others might be a press it again. So for example, with the dancing monkey, he stops and to reactivate him, you press again. And then our final one, turn on and off again. So you would press the switch to turn the toy on, and then you would press the switch to turn the toy off. I would very rarely start with that type of activity, as it can be quite confusing when you're developing cause and effect, the fact that the switch has two different functions. So really, I would start with the press it again idea, as the child is then consistently linking, I've pressed that, something's happened. I've pressed it again, something's happened again. So it's much more easy to understand. Using Big Mac switches to build on cause and effect. So I'm sure many of you have seen Big Mac switches. They're basically a switch that you can record a single message on, and the child then presses that so they can be involved in an interaction. This can help to expand on the communication element of cause and effect. The child learns that when they press the switch, they create a message, which then causes the communication partner to react. So that's really quite a powerful means of cause and effect. I'll give you an example. Let's say I was working with a child and I was blowing bubbles, and then I paused. The child might press the switch and the message might say, I want some more. And then I would blow some more bubbles. So they would learn from that interaction that when they press the switch, they encouraged me to respond and blow more bubbles. You can add a symbol to the switch to build on symbolic knowledge. So for example, if I knew I was working on the word more, I might print out the word more, the symbol more, and attach it to the switch. So the child is linking the symbol with the word they're hearing on the switch. There are lots of different ways that you can use Big Mac switches to build on cause and effect. This is a little handout that I made for parents at our school during the school closure. If you would like a copy of this, you can find it on my Twitter page, which is @sazolder, or you can we can send you a copy of it so you can have a little look at some of the activities that are on that handout. So moving on from cause and effect, there are a number of other skills that a child needs to develop before they can really effectively access a communication aid. Some children, we work through these kind of step by step. Some children, you find they pick up the skills very quickly and we can bypass steps, or we can work on these steps within using a communication aid. But generally, in terms of good practice, we would work through these kind of steps to ensure that the child has the skills that they need. So some of the other switch skills that a child might need are timing. So for example, if a child is pressing the switch at the wrong time, they're going to select an item that they don't want when they're going through a scan on their communication aid, and that could be quite frustrating. So we need to develop those timing skills. We can use games to develop timing. The image at the top here, Splat the Clown, this is taken from Help Kids Learn. And the idea of this is that when the clown is in the yellow circle in the center, the child presses the switch and the clown is splatted with the custard pie. So you can imagine the kids really enjoy that. They find it quite funny. But if the clown is on the outside of the circle in the black area and the child presses the switch, the custard pie misses the clown. So they quite quickly learn that they need to wait, and it's developing that idea of timing. Moving on from timing, and this is really starting to look at that kind of communication element, using a switch for simple choice making. So maybe making a choice between two options to begin with. I quite often introduce this using objects before I even move on to tech, as when you're using objects, you have a little bit more control and you can think about the timing of that scan. So this is a little picture taken from Ian Bean's switch progression roadmap, which I have a link for later. And you'll see there are two toys here. There's a ladybird and there is, I think he is Dougal from the Magic Roundabout. So what you would do is you would cut out a red square, which looks like our scanning highlight. You would position it over the toy and you might say, do you want the ladybird? And pause. Or do you want Dougal the dog? And pause. And then the child might have a message on a Big Mac switch such as, I want that one. So they're learning that they're pressing the switch and they're making a selection. The good thing about starting with objects is you can think about the time. So I would maybe count in my head how many seconds it's taking the child to process what I've said or what they've seen. So there's a lot of skills involved in choice making and scanning. The child has to process quite a lot of things. They have to visually process what they can see in front of them. They have to begin to get their body part in position, and then they have to time that with activating the switch at the right time. So we have to consider all of those elements and the time that it takes for the child to do that. So let's say that within an activity like this, I find that it took the child 5 seconds maybe to process and press the switch. I then have that information moving forwards when we look at a communication aid, and I know that I can set the scan for maybe 5 or 6 seconds because that was what we worked towards with objects. Again, there's also games that we can use for working on choice making. This is another example from Help Kids Learn. It's called Auntie Maggie's Recipe. The idea of this is that you're making a magic potion. So 2 options might pop up on the screen. You might have, let's say, eyeballs and worms, and there would be a scan. Again, you can set the time, and the child would press the switch when they see the option that they want. And it's errorless, so it doesn't matter what they press, something fun is going to happen. I think it's quite important to start with errorless activities, as we want the child to be motivated to use the switch and to enjoy the activities. We don't want them to become frustrated or to give up. So we'll talk a little bit more about scanning now. So scanning is really the skill that a child will use if they're using a communication aid. So you can see this is an example of scanning in the top screen. We have an iPad here, and there are 6 photographs of food. The item that is highlighted with the red square, that means that that is the item that the child can currently select when pressing their switch. There are different methods of scanning, and I'm going to talk about each briefly. Obviously, you can learn more about these means of scanning, but I thought I would explain each of them briefly to you. So the first is using one switch. So a child will generally use one switch to activate a communication aid if they only have one reliable access site on assessment. So remember a few slides ago, we looked at different access points. If when you've done that assessment process, you find that there's really only one body movement that the child has that's reliable and consistent and easy, then one switch is really ideal for that child. So when we're using one switch for a scan, the scan starts automatically, but again, you can select the speed. The child then selects the item that they want by pressing the switch when the item that they want is highlighted. So there's a few drawbacks of using one switch. The first is that it requires considerable concentration. So you can imagine you really need to focus on the screen. If you miss the item that you want, you then have to wait for the scan to restart and come back around again. It also requires that intentional movement, so the child is selecting the item that they do want. So we'll have a little look at 2-switch scanning. Again, if you've done your assessment and you find that the child has multiple access points that are reliable, so it might be that they can use their right hand and their left hand. It might be that they can use their head and their left hand, their head and their knee. So any 2 points that are reliable, they could be a really good option for using 2 switches, which is really quite a fast way of scanning and quite a fast way of communicating. So the idea of a 2-switch scan is that one switch moves the scan, and then the second switch selects the item. So the child would move through the items until they get to the item that they want, and then they would press the other switch to select. As you can imagine, this means that the child has much more control over the scan and certainly the speed of the scan, which is why when a child becomes really competent at using 2 switches, it can be a really, really fast means of communication. The other nice thing about using 2 switches is the child generally develops a cognitive map as to what each switch is used for. So they know one switch moves, the other selects. Initially, the child might struggle to attach this meaning, so they need to have that cognitive understanding of what each switch does. But once that's developed, then it's pretty consistent and we can move on from there. As I mentioned before, the child must have 2 reliable access sites to be able to use 2 switches for scanning. So our third method of scanning is row column. So this can be used with 1 switch or 2 switches. Generally, this is a more complex means of accessing a communication aid, and it's generally when you have lots of items on a screen that you would begin to use row column scanning. So lots of vocabulary items on the screen, or perhaps a keyboard on the screen, you would use this type of scan. So the idea of row column is that each row is indicated one at a time. The child has to watch to see which row contains the item that they want. And then the child presses the switch when the row they want is highlighted. Each item on the row is then scanned individually. So it goes along the column. The child has to look out for the item that they want coming up. Then they press the switch when they see the item that they want highlighted. Again, this can be a really quick method and a really successful method. I've seen lots of really competent communicators using row column scanning. The child needs to have a good understanding of the process, and it's rarely something that we jump in with. We tend to very much build up to this, and then over time can expand on how many rows, how many columns that the child is scanning through. So again, it's that process of ongoing assessment. Just a few more tips and ideas around scanning, and scanning is probably the most complex area. It is a difficult skill and it does take time to develop. So here are just a few tips just from my own experience of working with children who've used scanning. So if you're using one switch, I would generally start on a slow scanning speed, as then you can tweak it from there. So if you find the child is becoming bored quite quickly, then you know that you can speed that scan up a little bit. But generally starting on a slow speed allows you to see how the child is processing what they're seeing and getting their movement ready to access the switch. I would also start with a limited amount of choices to scan through. To be honest with you, in most cases, I would start with 2 choices. So as I mentioned earlier, I might start with something like more and stop, or I might start with 2 activities the child has to choose between, and then that's something that you can gradually build on. I mentioned this before, but it's good to start with errorless activities so that it's fun. So there's no right option. Any option that the child selects is motivational and interesting to the child. Over time, then, you might want to throw in a red herring to check that the child really is intentionally activating the switch. So you might do this by putting in a choice that the child perhaps doesn't like, or maybe a really favorite choice. Let's say, for example, I was doing a music activity with a child and I knew that they didn't like Ed Sheeran. So I might have Little Mix, Taylor Swift, Ed Sheeran. If I find the child was frequently selecting Ed Sheeran, then that would make me think, okay, what's going wrong here? Is the scan too fast? Is the child not understanding that they're pressing the switch and selecting? Are they not attending to the screen and the choices? So it then helps you to kind of go back and have a look at where maybe the process isn't quite working and what you might need to work on or tweak. You can use software to develop the scanning skills. So software like Choose It Maker, which is also on Help Kids Learn, and there's also Switch It Maker, and these can develop skills around scanning. So the top picture here, this is an example of Choose It Maker. It's also really great software to use in the classroom, as teachers can make activities related to whatever they're doing. They can choose how many items they put on the screen. They can choose the time setting. So you can see here in this example, we have on holiday I went to, and there are 3 different options. When the item is scanned, it has a red highlight border and the background turns yellow. So that's a really nice piece of software for developing those skills and also for working on curriculum activities in the classroom. When we're looking at scanning, there are lots and lots of settings on most software, especially if you're looking at communication software. And it's important to consider the visual and the auditory settings, as some of these can make a massive difference to how the child accesses that communication software. I'll give you an example. So last year I was working with a young girl and we were starting the process of scanning, and we were looking at music choices, and we initially had the scan set to highlight. so that the red border would come up around the cell. I noticed that the child wasn't particularly interested in the screen. She wasn't really watching it. She certainly wasn't making any motion towards the switch. So I looked at the settings and I changed it to a highlighted background. So rather than just having the red border, the background of the cell that is selectable turns blue and it really pops out. And as soon as I did that, the young girl understood and could visually see which option she could select. So that changed everything. And it just highlighted to me the importance of looking at those different settings and how it can really make a massive difference. There's also auditory settings. So as I mentioned earlier, if a child has difficulties with their vision, that doesn't mean that they can't use communication software with a switch or scanning, as they can use auditory scanning. So they would have an auditory cue, and when they hear the auditory cue, they would press the switch to make their selection. I thought on a slightly different vein, we would have a quick look at adapting an iPad for switch use. As I know, within most schools, you will have iPads, and it's important to make those accessible both for communication apps and for apps that you might use in lessons. So I thought I'd show you two of the ways that you can adapt an iPad for switch use. The first is using a Bluetooth switch box. There are lots of different options for these on the Inclusive Technology website. So basically you plug the switch into a Bluetooth box, you enable the Bluetooth settings on the iPad. You might want to look at the accessibility features there as well. And that means that then the iPad is accessible with the switch. The only drawbacks I have found with the Bluetooth switch box is the battery life isn't always brilliant. That might have improved recently, but I do find you have to charge them quite frequently. So our bottom option is the more expensive of the two, the Tobii Dynavox speech case, but I do have to say it is my favourite of the two. It is about £350, but I think if a child is going to use their iPad as a communication aid long term, then it's probably worth the investment. So the idea is you slot the iPad into the speech case, you can then plug a switch in, and the speech case also acts as a speaker for the iPad, so that's quite useful as well. The battery life is generally quite good. So yes, they're quite a useful piece of kit. I'm going to pass it over to Erica now, and she's going to talk to you a little bit about switches for general computer access, and then she'll pass back to me and we'll just finish up with looking at some resources that might be useful for you.
Thanks, Sarah. Can you hear me all right? Is that okay? Yep. So yeah, a lot of the skills that Sarah has been talking about, so the looking, attending, the cause and effect, the timing and the scanning applies when you're using switches for computer access as well. A few things that I couldn't live without when using switches for my students to access the computer is a CRIT box straight away, which is a USB interface which allows switch control on the computer. And for your students who, as Sarah touched on before, need a change of position maybe and their access method isn't always the same, they can keep their switch in the best position for them and attach the switch to the USB and use that to control the computer, so you're not using another switch. Something that we found since going back to schools in September, the wireless jelly beam, I think, is invaluable because it's a wire. As our students can't move around now that they're in their bubbles and they can't move as freely within the classroom, the wireless switch can be held by the teacher and taken to the individual child using a whole group activity around the TV or the whiteboard. And obviously can be, more importantly at the moment, can be clean between each child. I must stress that. And I think it just allows for, obviously, the benefits of it being wireless. You can move it right around the whole classroom. Using the Switch It series, such as the Technology and the Switch It Sports Extra, are great for developing those skills, which I know Sarah's touched on quite a bit with the Help Kids Learn and the different Choose It makers. The Switch It series, the Technology and the Sport, I think are definitely great for your slightly older students as well. And there's a wide range of learning software which is switch accessible. Clicker is, off the top of my head, is the one that we use quite frequently. over the summer, Highfurlong School and National Star College have been asked to lead for the SEND strategy of the Demonstrator School programme. And we have been running these Tech and SEND Thursdays. And what we're going to do is look at a physical kit on the 1st of October. And we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive into the more specialist kit on the 17th of December. So they're running at 4:15. And what I'm going to do is send out the schedule for that and Sarah's using switches at home handout, as well as two resources that I made over the summer, which were my top 10 pieces for AAC and top 10 pieces for assistive technology. Just kind of things that if you're starting to introduce it into your schools, what it could be a different answer for everybody, but our experience of using these pieces of kit in school, these are kind of what we would recommend as our top 10 we can't do without. So I will email those to everybody with the links for today's webinar. And for more Switch accessible software for learning, there is a link for the inclusive website below. And I'll hand you back to Sarah.
Yep, so we're just finishing up, but I thought I would show you some useful resources, some of the things that I've drawn on today when I was putting this little webinar together. I've already mentioned Ian Bean's Switch Progression Roadmap, but this is a really great tool and it's free. So I've included the links here for everything that I'm recommending. But I would really, really highly recommend Ian Bean's Switch Progression Roadmap. It basically talks you through each of the different stages of developing switch skills and ties in with activities related to each skill. So it's a great resource to have in the classroom. The second one here, activities for developing switch use. So this is really a list of switch adapted toys and switch adapted equipment, and that was put together by the assistive technology team at Barnsley. So it gives you links as to where you can purchase some of those items, which might be useful for you in the classroom as well. That's great for developing those cause and effect type skills that we talked about in depth earlier. Ian Bean, again, he's a bit of a switching hero. So online professional development and switch activities. So today has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour on switching, but if you want to have a little bit more in-depth information about specific skills or working on specific areas, then this is kind of a professional development site where you can watch more webinars related to switches. I think you can sign up for a small fee. Then at the bottom, this is a website that I just happened to find while I was working on this webinar, and it had loads of great ideas and advice on developing switch skills, and it's called TalkSense. So that's worth checking out as well if you work with children who use switches quite frequently. So just to finish up, we have the link at the top here that you can click to watch previous webinars that we've done. So we've done webinars around an introduction to AAC or communication aids. We've done an introduction to assistive technology, and we've also done a little look at symbol supported software. If you want to follow any of us on Twitter, our Twitter handles are here. So at Erica Smith 2019, at Saz Older, that's me, our head teacher at Neil Oldham, and then our school at Highfurlong. So we all tend to tweet and post about assistive technology and communication. So it would be great to connect with some of you on Twitter as well. And I think all that's left to say is if anybody has any questions, Erica and I will try our best to answer those.
Hi, Sarah. I was just going to ask, with the scanning, is it only certain software that would have the scanning available?
Yes, I suppose it depends what software you're using. I think on things like an iPad, you can actually scan through the different apps on an iPad screen, for example. So that would be changing the accessibility features on your iPad. But most of the software that is switch accessible is kind of specialist software. If that answers your question.
That's fine, thank you.
And most communication software will have obviously the option for scanning.
Okay, thank you, thanks.
I can say from an educational perspective, Clicker definitely has a scanning feature.
Any other questions?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Ah, yes. Oh, brilliant. Oh, just out of interest, very briefly, what would you consider as the easiest means of accessing a switch? What would how do you define that? Yeah.
I suppose the traditional means of accessing a switch is pressing a switch with your hand, so that up and down motion. But what's easy for one child is hard for another child, so every child is completely individual. So it really depends on which part of the body is most accessible for the child, which switch is easiest for the child. And that's why that whole assessment process is really important. But in terms of which you would see the most frequently is generally that hand access.
So if a child, for example, has their hand in a particular position, it may be to one side, the back of the chair. Would you bring the switch to the hand, if you like, as opposed to the child trying to get the switch on the tray, that sort of thing?
You could mount the switch so that it's very close to the hand. So for example, I have worked with children where the switch is maybe mounted sideways and they might move very slightly with the side of their hand towards the switch. So it's any small kind of intentional movement. If we are bringing the switch to the child, then it's not in a consistent position. And also it's not really their intentional movement, it's ours. So we need to make sure that it's in a position that is easily accessible for them, which can be a bit of trial and error initially, but it's worth persevering with and finding what's best for that child.
Oh, that sounds excellent. Thank you very much.
No worries. What I would say is if you're working with a child who's particularly complex and you're not quite sure how they're going to access the switch, I would definitely recommend trying to get in touch with your local AAC service. So for example, I worked with a child recently and we looked at an eye blink switch, which is quite specialist technology, as you can imagine. So in those kind of cases, it's really good to link up with someone who has lots of experience in the area, as they can give you really kind of specialist information and assessment. Any other questions?
I think that's everything, Sarah. I think that was brilliant. Thank you so much. And we will email all the attachments out that we've mentioned today, as well as the recording of today's webinar. So thank you very much for joining us, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.